Hey class, in this video we're going to go over some basics with Adobe Animate, and we're going to make a very simple animated GIF we'll post to the Open Lab for our blog post 5. I'm just going to get started. I'm going to talk about the interface, and then I'll talk about a few techniques. Animate, just like Photoshop, is a very sort of complex, robust program, so we're not going to be able to cover every single little feature, but I'll kind of go through the basics of how you can use it and some of the important things to be looking out for, and we can get started. I'm gonna close my window and I'll open up Animate. When you open Animate for the first time, this is what it's going to look like. You may see like a little pop-up with some tutorials. You can ignore those, or if you want to look at them, you can. But to get started, we can just create a new file. So I'm going to click New File over here. And then it's going to give me some different presets, and I can kind of go through those presets and look for something that matches what I'm going for. But I want to make just kind of a simple animated GIF right now, so I'm not going to do anything too crazy. So I'm just going to do the same height and width. I'll just do a square. So I'm going to do 512 by 512. And then for the frame rate, I'm going to do 24 frames per second. So in the animation lecture, we kind of talked about the illusion of motion and how we string together a bunch of drawings or images to create the sense of motion. The frame rate is kind of what determines how many images there are in 1 second. And the more images we have per second, the more fluid or real the motion is going to look. For most people, once you get past 24 frames a second, they're not going to notice a big difference. So 24 is kind of a good place to start with making an animation. I think the default is 30. That's good too. But 24 is kind of the standard for most animated shorts or films or whatever. So we're going to go with 24 for the frame rate, and we're going to click Create, and we're going to see the Animate window. So just like Photoshop, with the Animate window, you can drag and drop all your different windows around. I'm not going to make any changes to the default, so I'm just going to kind of leave it as is. But some people prefer to have things in different places depending on what their workflow is like. Just like in Photoshop, there's a window menu up here where you can, if I go down here a little bit, you can see some of the default workspaces. You can see I just have the Essentials workspace. If you make changes to what you're looking at, you can just click Reset Essentials and go back to the beginning. But you can see what's open here by what's checked. So there's the edit bar, the timeline. Excuse me. There's the tools bar. There's a library. And that's basically the main things that we need. You can see there's a lot of other stuff here, and some of those things will actually open as we're editing, depending on what tools we're using. But we'll look at that as we go. So that's the window section, but again, with Animate, I don't really do too much to change things around. So our main sort of window where we're going to be working is this big window right in the middle, which I guess doesn't have its own name. It's always there. And there's a couple useful things with this to know right away. If you want to zoom in or out, if you go to this drop down right here and go Fit to Window, it's going to fit the entire canvas to your window. When you're drawing, you might want to zoom in to see what it looks like at 100%, or zoom in even further to get more details. But you can always go back to Fit to the Window. And you can also hit Control plus and minus, or Command plus and minus on the Mac, and then Control 2 will fit to window. So I do Control 2 a lot. If I zoom in to do something, then I want to zoom back out. So Control or Command 2 on the Mac will do that. So that's our window here. When you look at the Properties toolbar over here, there's a few different contexts here. And you can see it, I think I'm small enough that you can see it. Over here on the document settings, that's where you're going to see the settings that we just set up. So you see the width and the height, and then the stage and the frames per second. So your frames per second should be 24. If you want to change the background color of your animation, you can click on that stage and you can choose a color, or you can open the color picker and grab a color in there. So that's the overall document settings. You can always change things right there. All right, so let's look at how we can actually add some stuff onto the canvas. and then we'll go over animating. I'm going to save this before I do any editing, just so I know that my project is saved. So I'm going to hit Control S or Command S on the keyboard. You can also go to File and Save. And since we haven't saved it yet, we don't have anything. I'm going to go to my MMP 100 folder, and this is our first animation project. So I'm going to right-click and create a new folder. And this should be the same on Mac or Windows. I'm going to call this animation, and I'm going to go in here. And I'm just going to call this animated GIF, because that's what we're going to be working on, just to kind of get started with animation. You'll notice that the type of file for this is FLA. That is from the previous version of Animate. Animate used to be a different software called Flash, which was a really popular animation and web development program. That's actually where I got my start when I was just first out of college. I worked for a Flash based game company. But Flash eventually stopped being updated, and then eventually it got turned into Animate. And so it's still pretty much the same thing, but now is known as Animate. So we can save that, and so now we have that saved on our computer. Now we can start to add some stuff. So the main way that you usually work with Animate is by either using the classic brush tool, which you can use to kind of draw lines on the screen and draw drawings. There's also the fluid brush tool, which is kind of similar but has some more has some more specific settings that you can do to get kind of more like an ink brush type feel. Those aren't that good to use with the mouse. You can try using it if you have like an external mouse like this. That might be good. I'm gonna kind of assume that you guys don't necessarily have access to something where you're going to want to use the brush tool a lot. So I'm going to kind of focus on just using the shapes. But most of the time when you're using Animate, you really wouldn't. You would usually use one of the brush tools to do most of the art. If you have a Wacom tablet or an iPad, something like this, where you can actually draw, that's a great way to do drawings and work in Animate. So you could do that. But I'm going to kind of assume that people might not have those things. So I'm just going to do a pretty basic animation, just using shapes and just moving things around with the mouse. But either one is perfectly fine for the project. So if I want to get rid of all this stuff, I can hit Control A to select everything on the canvas and then just hit delete. If I wanted to get rid of just some things, I could grab the selection tool. So the selection tool is this main pointer arrow up here. And if I click on individual forms and then click delete, it'll delete them. Notice that it didn't show the blue behind it, even though I had painted over. The way that Animate works is when you're painting, everything just kind of gets flattened out. So if I have some blue part and I go in and I paint this part over it, now when I grab this, it's a whole new part. It just breaks it up. So that's a good thing to be aware of when you first get started using Animate. So I'm just going to get rid of some of this stuff. Another thing to be aware of, so let's say I have a painting like this, so I can select it and move it around, do different things with it. But there's also this transform tool. So if I click on the transform tool, I can rotate, I can scale, and I can kind of skew or kind of like warp that drawing. So the free transform tool, which is the second arrow with the box, lets you do a lot of other manipulations to the drawing. So you use those tools a lot. You can select them on the keyboard using V for the select tool and Q for the free transform tool. And you can also move around with the free transform. So those are pretty useful to know about. There's also an eraser. If you draw something and you just want to kind of erase a little bit of it, the eraser is useful for that. Another good thing to use. You can also select with the selection by making a big box over everything that you want to select. You can see when things get selected, they get this kind of like dot pattern on top of them. So that lets you know what's selected. Let's move on to the shape tool. So you can make rectangles. If I hold this down, you can see there's ovals and there's other stuff. So I'm going to use a circle. So I'm just going to draw an oval. If you draw a circle, you can make a circle or an ellipse that has or an oval that has a different width and height, or if I hold shift, it'll just make a circle. So let's make a little circle. And then if I want to play with that circle, I can get my move tool around. Notice that when I take this, it has a fill and a stroke, and if I move this out, these are like two different things, and now I've got this like separate fill and stroke. So I'm going to undo that for a second, and we'll look at those properties, but then we'll see how that works. So with my circle, if I make a circle, after I make it, I can change before I make it. So let's actually delete these guys. So before I make the circle, I can set what it's going to look like. So I can change the color. Maybe I'll change the color to purple. And so they got to give me a nice purple shape. There's also a stroke. That's kind of the outline. So the default stroke is black, but I can change that as well. And I can make it larger if I want to. So you can make different shapes like that. I don't necessarily want it to look like that, so I'm going to delete these. And I'm just going to make a circle with no stroke. So if I don't want a stroke, or you can do this with the fill, just click on that little white box with the red slash. I'll get rid of that. So let's just make a circle, and we're just going to animate it. So I'm just going to put it right there. I'm going to move it right here into the center of the canvas. And what I'm going to do is just going to kind of animate it around. So we're going to get into some animating. There's a lot more you can do with these different tools. There's a pen tool, there's a type tool, there's a fill tool, but we're just going to get started with some animation. So animating is kind of tricky. There's a lot of stuff that you have to kind of keep track of. You can start out and it'll be pretty easy, but as you keep working, it's going to get a little trickier. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take this circle and I'm going to make new copies of it and move them to make it look like it's moving. And I'm going to do that using my timeline. So other than drawing and making stuff in the canvas, the main place where you're going to spend your time is in the timeline. In your timeline, you have layers, kind of like in Photoshop. And we can name the layers, and we can make multiple layers and do different things with them. So I'm just going to rename this layer circle. Oops. I hit some unnecessary key commands there. And okay. You have to be a little bit careful, because if you hit random keys, random stuff can happen. Okay, so let's rename our layer. I'm going to call it circle. We want to name it something that makes sense. The layer has a toggle, so if I toggle this eyeball on and off, you'll hide it. So if you have lots of layers, that can be useful to isolate certain things. And we can also lock it. So if I lock the layer, I won't be able to make any changes to it. If I unlock it, now I can move it around. Okay. So now those are our layers. Over here, this big blue bar, that's called the playhead. And the playhead tells us what frame we're on. And so if I try to move the playhead, I don't have any other frames, so it's not going to let me move it. So if I want to move, I have to make a new frame. And there's a few different ways to do that. And this is where things start to get a little complicated. So there's this button here called Insert Keyframe. There's also these step forward and step backward buttons. And then if I hold down on this, there's a few different types of keyframes. So a frame is just one drawing or one image in your animation. A keyframe is a special frame where something changes. And the way that we're going to be doing animation today is called frame by frame animation. And so that means basically every frame has a big change or some type of change. And so we're going to have lots of keyframes. We're mostly going to be working with keyframes. In the future, when we do tween animation, then you don't use as many keyframes. But for now, we're going to add keyframes. So if I add, so I have a few different types of frames here. If I add a keyframe, this is like a copy of the first frame. And so I can move the circle, and now I have two different frames with the same circle in different positions. So I can do a little slight animation. If I add a blank keyframe, then there's nothing there, and I can draw something else. If I add a frame, now my animation is a little bit longer, but nothing's changed. So you can see I just have the two frames. To play back an animation in Animate, you just hit Enter. I only have 2 frames, so nothing happens. So it doesn't really, nothing happens, but you can see the playhead going back and forth. So when we're doing a frame by frame animation, basically what we're going to do is add a new keyframe and then change it somehow and then keep going. So I'm going to go back to keyframe. And so that adds a keyframe, and I'm going to move it just a little bit like that. And it's moving kind of weird. I probably have some kind of snapping turned on. So let's see if we can... Okay, I'm going to turn snap off. Okay. I'm just going to turn off all the snapping. I don't really want to deal with snapping right. Well, actually, maybe I want bitmaps to pixel. Okay. Okay, so now I have a little animation. You can see it moves just a little bit. And then if I hit the keyframe button again, and I move the ball again a little bit, now it's moving a little bit. Okay. That's basically a process. We just keep doing that. But there's a couple things that are going to help us speed it along. One of those is using keyframes. So if I hold over this and then we look at these keyframes, there's a few different types of frames, and each one has a keyboard shortcut that you can do it pretty quickly. The F5 adds a frame, so you can see it adds a new frame, and if I keep hitting that, it keeps going. I don't really want to do that, but just as an example. F6 adds a new copy of that keyframe, which is what we were doing before. And then F7 adds a blank keyframe, which might be interesting if you're hand drawing, you probably want to use F7. If you're doing what I'm doing, you probably want to use F6 mostly. The F keys, if you're not familiar, are those like little keys on the top of the keyboard. And in Animate, we use these constantly. If you're on a Mac or if your keyboard doesn't have F keys, you can remap those keys. This isn't super easy, so we might want to go over this in office hours, but if you go into Edit and you go to keyboard shortcuts, you can actually change all the shortcuts. And what I do when I'm on the Mac is I look for a keyframe and I find those keyframe thingies, so F7, F6, and F5 is just frame. And I just set these to the numbers instead of the F keys. So I would do F7 is 7, so I would just add 7 here, and F6 is 6. So I just add 6 here. Okay, so if you haven't worked with keyboard shortcuts a lot before, that might be kind of confusing. But that's what I would do if you don't have those F keys, or if you're on a Mac where you have to do the function to hit the F key. Anyway, if that makes sense, that's great. If not, we can go over it in office hours. And then you can hit OK and save those. And now I can actually just hit 6 instead of F6 if I want. Okay. So now I can hit F6 and move this guy a little bit. The next thing that's kind of challenging is that each frame that I go through, I can kind of see or remember where it's coming from, but I don't know exactly. So that's another thing that's really useful, and all animation programs have this, and this is the onion skin. So the onion skin is right here. You can hit Alt-Shift-O to get that, or I can just turn it on by clicking on it. And the onion skin just shows me the last few frames and the next few frames in the animation. So the default is that the older frames, the previous frames are blue, and the next frames are green. So we can see which is which, and we can kind of see the path of our circle animation. You can set these settings. If I hold this down and go to advanced settings, you can set all this stuff. You can set the colors, you can set the opacity, you can set how many frames there are. I actually usually stick with the default. Occasionally, you can also use the this little drag guy if you hover over the blue or the green line down here on the timeline. If you drag those around, you'll get to see more or less. So that's really useful. That's the onion skin. Another thing that's really useful to move back and forth on the timeline is using the back and forth keys. These are on the keyboard. If I can, you see right there next to the M. They look like two arrows, so they're not the actual arrow keys, but they're the less than and greater than keys, which are also the period and comma keys. This can help you move back and forth, and we do this a lot just to kind of go back and forth between frames. So let's hit F6 and let's keep going with our animation. And I'm just going to keep hitting F6 and just kind of moving the ball a little bit outwards in a spiral. we're not going to spend a ton of time going over kind of like real animation techniques because we have such a short amount of time. But one of the things you'll notice that I'm doing right now is as I'm continuing through the animation, my jumps or the amount of space that I'm going is getting wider. The farther we move in an animation, the faster it's going to look like we're moving. And so that's just an easy way to make it look like I'm speeding up. So the farther the ball travels between frames, the faster this animation will look. And I'm just going to kind of spiral all the way out until I get maybe to like here. Okay, so let's play that back. Okay, so that's pretty good. It's not perfect. I might play with some of those frames, but it's a pretty decent animation. And now what I'm going to do is I want to go over a couple things to watch out for. So I'm going to spiral back into the center. So I'm going to make my animation a little bit longer, and I'm going to copy my first frame and put it at the end of what I want my animation to be, so that it'll be seamless. It'll end in the same place where it starts. It's kind of hard to see it right here, so let's see if I can make this. I can't really. Can I make this window? Oh, I can do that. Okay, I'm gonna hide this window for a second. You probably will see it right here. There's like a little mountain thing, and this shows you all the frames in your animation. So if you make this smaller, then you'll see more frames, and you'll start to see the seconds. For our first animated GIF, we don't need it to be super long. I'm gonna make it like 2 seconds long, but that's something that you might want to use to see how long it is. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab that keyframe and I'm going to hit Control C, and then I'm going to go to exactly 2 seconds. So I'm going to click on that frame and I'm going to hit Control V, and that doesn't seem like it worked. Okay, I'm going to undo that. Let's try that again. So I'm going to grab this, I'm going to hit Control C, and I'm going to go here. Okay, that still didn't work. So let's try a different method. Okay, maybe I'll right click and click copy frames. Oh, okay, I was doing the wrong thing. Okay, copy frames is Control Alt C. So it's different than just regular copy. Okay, so now I'm gonna paste frames. Okay, there we go. Now I've got my last frame at the end, back to where we started. So now I can make a seamless animation. Your animation doesn't have to be seamless, but I just thought that that would be fun. And so now if I turn the onion skin back on, I can't really see where I'm going, but if I move it all the way to the end, now I can see where I'm ultimately going. And I have a little less than 2 seconds because I went a little over 2 seconds, so I have a little less than 2 seconds to get there, which is fine. So now I'm gonna keep going with my animation, so I'll hit F6 and just move back towards this. Oops. Okay, so this is what I wanted you to watch out for. I don't know why this happens, but I'm gonna hit Control Z a few times to undo. Sometimes when I do this, what happens just happens. So sometimes when I'm not sure what causes it, but sometimes all your frames get selected and something weird happens. I think because I made all these extra frames, when I hit F6 and I move here, see, now they're all selected. And if I hit F6 again, suddenly I'm all the way at the end. I don't know why it does that. But one of the things you have to watch for is if your frames are selected and all of them are selected, when you make a manipulation, when you add a keyframe, it's going to add it to all of the frames. So I don't really want that. So maybe I'll hit F7, and then maybe it'll let me just do F6. No, okay. So I'm not exactly sure, honestly, what the best way to deal with this is. Maybe I can no, it won't let me do this either because it doesn't let me have. You know what? Maybe what I need to do. Okay, I think this is what I need to do. I know what my last frame is. But maybe if I'm here and I hit F6. Okay. Okay. So this is going to be different depending on what you're doing, but just watch the timeline. Just watch down there and see if anything goofy happens, so that you can avoid this. Okay. Let me see if I go like this. Okay, so now I have that frame. Okay, now if I hit F6, no, see, it covers that frame. Okay, about F5, F6. I can hit F5 and then F6. Is that what I'm gonna have to do? I'm gonna have to hit F5 to make a new frame and then F6 so that I don't delete that last frame. Okay, so sometimes you have to be a little creative about how you get this done, but you don't have to have a seamless animation. So maybe you'll just say, you know what, this is too complicated. I'm just gonna make something else. See, I just screwed up. But you can really just like draw and go crazy. For this animated GIF, I just want to see something kind of wacky, just, you know, play around with different tools and get something that looks kind of cool. I gotta get this guy closer. There we go. Okay, so now let's watch this back. And I'll turn off the onion skin. Okay, so it's pretty close to what I was going for. It's not exactly right, but we get this kind of fun animation. And then if you want to see what it's going to look like when you publish it, you can hit Control Enter, and it'll publish a looping version of it. Okay, so that looks pretty good. I'm pretty happy with that. I'm going to go over how to post this on the blog, and this will be our blog post too. I'm going to do another video where I talk about another method, but it's really kind of like more of an advanced method, and it's not required for everybody to do. So it's really just if you want to do something a little bit more advanced, you can do that, but you don't have to. So what I'm going to do now is just post this on the blog, and then in another video, I'll talk about another thing that we can do with Animate that I think for some of you will be really useful, and for some of you, you'll say, you know what, I don't really care about that. Okay, so let's export an animated GIF and post it on our blog. So to export in Animate, I just go to File and then go to Export. And for this one, there's a few different options. For this one, I'm going to choose Animated GIF because that's what we're making. And that'll bring up this kind of export window. There's, you know, a bunch of stuff here that you don't really have to worry about. They should all be fine. My window is a little bit too small to see everything, but you should see like a save button down here. I'm hoping that if I hit enter, it'll come up, and there we go. Just make sure it's in the right folder and click save, and click save again, I guess. And let's go over, let's open up our file explorer, and we'll find our animation project, and here's our animated GIF. And that looks pretty good. All right, so let's get out of here. So now we want to post this on the blog. So I'm going to go to Open Lab and scroll up here and go to the plus and just call this my animated GIF. If you have like a specific title for your project, that's fine. But this is really just us getting started. So then for categories, I'm going to choose animation and weekly blog post. And then I'm just going to drop this in here. There's one thing that you have to watch out for. Oh, let me hide my. Okay, so sorry, that wasn't on screen. So for categories, choose animation and weekly blog post. One thing that you have to watch out for with WordPress when you want to upload your GIF. So let's drag the GIF over here. Okay, so it's gonna look like it's working for a moment, but I think when I preview this, okay, it's still working. So that's good. So if it's working, if it's animating, then you're fine. You don't have to worry about it. But if you notice that your image is not animating, what you should check is under block, click on the image. So I've got the image selected, go to block and go to resolution. And there's a few different options for resolution. One of the things that WordPress does when you upload an image is it makes a bunch of copies of it. And some of those copies are not going to be animated. They're just going to be the image. So if I do medium, you can see it's not animated. So with an animated GIF, it has to be full size for the animation to work. Okay, so then just write your description. I animated a seamless ball spiraling around. It really can be anything for this project. This is just to kind of get started. We're not like planning out a whole animation yet. We're going to start doing that later. But yeah, just, give a little description and then click publish, and that'll be that. And then I'll show you guys how to submit this on Brightspace as well. So once you've got this, you're going to copy this link, and then we'll go over to Brightspace. I'm going to go into Learner View, and I'll go to Assignments. And this is blog post 5. Okay, so we have to export our animated GIF and post on OpenLab. We did that, and then post our FLA file. So the file we're going to add is the .fla file. So this is going to be in animation, and it should have the Animate logo. If you don't see the Animate logo, that's a good sign that that's not the right file. You don't want to submit the animated GIF for this, or the Swift file if you have a Swift file here. Just the animated GIF.fla. There's also, they make a backup, so if you see a file that has recover in all caps, that's only there in case your computer crashes. It'll have a backup available. So we don't want to submit that one, even though it's the problem with this one is it's going to be one version earlier than what you've worked on, so it's not the right file. So don't submit recover, submit animated GIF.fla, and so just click open and add, and then we're just gonna Control V, paste the link to the OpenLab in there, and then click submit. So that's it. If you just want to submit this, and that's good, that's fine. I'm gonna do one quick video, as I mentioned, about doing symbols, and so that's a nice way to make slightly more complex animations in Animate. But it's not required, so you should only do that if you want to learn a little bit more. All right, I will see you guys in the next video.